Good evening, and welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth, and tonight we're pulling back the curtain on a story that sits at the intersection of human trafficking, international tourism, and diplomatic damage control. Cambodia wants your travel dollars back, but the question is, should you trust them?
I'm Maya Clarity, and this is a story that deserves serious scrutiny. We're talking about a country that became synonymous with industrial-scale fraud operations, compounds where thousands of people were lured, trapped, and forced to run online scams. Now Cambodia's tourism board is on a charm offensive, targeting Hong Kong specifically. We'll break down the promises, the skepticism, and what's really happening on the ground.
Before we dive in, let's set the stage. Cambodia's scam compound crisis isn't some minor footnote. We're talking about an operation so vast, so brutal, that it triggered diplomatic incidents across Asia. People from Hong Kong, mainland China, Taiwan, Southeast Asia, and even parts of Africa were trafficked into these compounds, had their passports confiscated, and were forced to commit cyber fraud under threat of physical violence.
And the scale of it, Alex, is staggering. At the peak, estimates suggested tens of thousands of people were trapped in these compounds, primarily concentrated in areas like Sihanoukville and along the Thai-Cambodian border. The United Nations, multiple governments, and international law enforcement agencies all flagged Cambodia as a critical hub for what they called modern slavery operations disguised as tech parks.
So with that backdrop, here's tonight's headline. According to reporting from the South China Morning Post, the head of Cambodia's tourism body is now actively courting Hong Kong travel agencies. Kim Manea, the CEO of the Cambodia Tourism Board, sat down with the Post and made a direct pitch: come back to Cambodia, bring your tourists, we're cleaning house.
And that pitch comes at a critical moment. Cambodia's tourism sector, which before the pandemic was one of the country's economic lifelines, has been absolutely devastated. Not just by COVID, but by the reputational fallout from the scam compound crisis. When your country becomes globally associated with kidnapping and forced labor, it turns out people don't want to vacation there. Who would have guessed?
Let's get into the specifics of what Kim Manea told the South China Morning Post. He stated that the Cambodian government is, and I'm quoting here, determined to eliminate the notorious scam compounds. He's looking to build direct partnerships with Hong Kong travel agencies as part of a broader strategy to rehabilitate Cambodia's image and get international visitors flowing back in.
Now here's where it gets interesting, Alex. The response from Hong Kong's travel industry has been, let's call it diplomatically cautious. Tour operators told the Post that safety remains the primary concern. And that's not just professional hedging. These agencies have clients, they have reputations, and some of them have dealt directly with cases where Hong Kong residents were trafficked into these compounds. You don't forget that quickly.
Exactly right. And let's talk about why Hong Kong specifically is such a strategic target for this charm offensive. Hong Kong was one of the most prominent sources of victims in the scam compound crisis. Multiple high-profile cases made headlines in the city, young people lured by fake job advertisements promising high-paying tech work in Cambodia, only to find themselves in prison and coerced into running romance scams, cryptocurrency fraud, and other schemes.
The Hong Kong government itself issued travel warnings about Cambodia. The Legislative Council held hearings on it. Families of victims went public with harrowing stories. So when we talk about Cambodia trying to woo Hong Kong, understand the depth of the wound they're trying to heal. This isn't a standard tourism marketing campaign. This is crisis-level reputation management for an entire nation.
So let's examine the Cambodian government's claims through an investigative lens. They say they're cracking down. And to be fair, there have been some visible enforcement actions. Cambodian authorities, often under intense pressure from China, have conducted raids on some of these compounds. There have been arrests. There have been deportations of trafficking victims back to their home countries.
But here's where the skepticism from the travel industry is well-founded, Alex. The crackdowns have been inconsistent at best. Multiple investigative reports from outlets across Asia have documented that while some compounds were shut down, others simply relocated. Some moved deeper into Cambodian territory, away from border areas where enforcement was concentrated. Others migrated to neighboring Myanmar and Laos, where governance is even weaker.
And this is the critical point that Cambodia's tourism pitch conveniently sidesteps: the scam compound industry didn't emerge in a vacuum. These operations required land, infrastructure, electricity, water, internet connectivity, and in many cases, the compounds were built with the knowledge or outright involvement of local officials and politically connected business figures. You don't build a facility housing hundreds of trafficked workers without someone in authority knowing about it.
That's the elephant in the room that Kim Manea's tourism pitch doesn't address. The structural conditions that enabled this crisis. Cambodia's governance challenges are well documented. Transparency International consistently ranks the country among the most corrupt in Asia. The judiciary lacks independence. Land concessions and business licenses in the areas where these compounds operated were granted through opaque processes. So when the tourism board says they're determined to eliminate the problem, the question is, determined to eliminate it despite the systemic factors that created it? Or determined to just make it less visible?
Let's talk about the economics driving this whole situation, because following the money reveals the real stakes. Before the pandemic, tourism accounted for a significant share of Cambodia's GDP. Angkor Wat alone was drawing millions of visitors annually. The temple complex is one of the most visited heritage sites in the world, and it was a cash cow for the Cambodian economy. Hotels, restaurants, tour guides, transportation, entire communities depended on that tourist flow.
And then came the double hit. First, COVID shut down international travel globally, which devastated tourism-dependent economies everywhere. But Cambodia got hit with a unique second punch. The scam compound scandal broke wide open during and after the pandemic. So while other countries in Southeast Asia were bouncing back as borders reopened, Cambodia was trying to recover from a pandemic with the additional burden of being internationally branded as a human trafficking hub.
The numbers tell the story. Cambodia's tourist arrivals have not recovered to pre-pandemic levels, and they're lagging behind regional competitors like Thailand, Vietnam, and Indonesia. And that's not just because of lingering COVID effects. It's because when potential tourists Google Cambodia travel, what comes up alongside the beautiful temple photos are news stories about people being kidnapped and forced into scam operations.
So from a purely strategic standpoint, targeting Hong Kong makes sense for Cambodia's tourism board. Hong Kong is a wealthy city with a strong outbound travel market. It's geographically close. There's established flight connectivity. And historically, before the crisis, Hong Kong was a significant source market for Cambodian tourism. But the irony is thick. Hong Kong is also the market most scarred by the scam compound crisis, making it simultaneously the most logical and the most difficult market to win back.
Now let's examine what a genuine crackdown would actually look like, versus what appears to be happening. A real, sustained effort to eliminate these operations would require several things. First, you need to go after the money. These scam compounds generate enormous revenue. We're talking billions of dollars in fraudulent proceeds flowing through cryptocurrency channels and informal banking networks. Following that money trail would lead to the financiers and organizers at the top.
Second, you'd need accountability for officials who enabled or profited from these operations. And this is where it gets politically uncomfortable for the Cambodian government. Investigative reporting has identified connections between some compound operators and figures with political ties. A genuine crackdown would mean prosecuting powerful people, not just raiding the physical locations and arresting low-level operators while the architects walk free.
Third, and this is something human rights organizations have been vocal about, you need to treat the trafficked workers as victims, not criminals. There have been documented cases where people rescued from these compounds were treated as illegal immigrants or even charged with fraud themselves, rather than being recognized as trafficking victims. That's not a crackdown on the scam industry. That's re-victimizing the people who were already exploited.
And fourth, you need transparency. Independent monitoring. International observers. Verifiable data on how many compounds have been shut down, how many have relocated, how many people have been rescued, and how many perpetrators have actually been convicted and sentenced. Without that kind of accountability framework, a tourism board CEO telling a newspaper that the government is determined is just words. Expensive, well-crafted public relations words, but words nonetheless.
Let's broaden the lens here, Maya, because Cambodia's scam compound crisis is part of a much larger regional pattern. What we've seen across mainland Southeast Asia, in Cambodia, Myanmar, and Laos in particular, is the emergence of what some analysts call scam cities. Purpose-built or repurposed economic zones that function as industrial-scale fraud factories, often with links to Chinese organized crime syndicates.
That's exactly right, Alex. And the geopolitics of this are fascinating and disturbing. Many of these operations are run by Chinese nationals or Chinese-speaking crime networks. The victims are often Chinese-speaking as well, recruited from China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Southeast Asian Chinese communities. The Cambodian government has been under enormous pressure from Beijing to crack down, because Chinese citizens are both perpetrators and victims in this ecosystem.
And that pressure from China creates its own complicated dynamic. On one hand, Chinese pressure has been the single most effective driver of enforcement action. When Beijing demanded crackdowns, Cambodia moved, conducting raids, deporting Chinese nationals, and shutting down some operations. On the other hand, this creates a sovereignty issue. Cambodia is acting on these compounds partly because a more powerful neighbor is demanding it, not necessarily because of independent institutional commitment to human rights and rule of law.
Which brings us to the deeper question about what this tourism pitch really represents. Is it evidence that Cambodia has genuinely turned a corner? That the government has recognized the scam compound crisis as both a moral failure and an economic catastrophe, and is taking sustained action to address it? Or is it a premature attempt to move past the narrative, to rebrand before the underlying problems are actually solved?
The Hong Kong travel industry's response suggests they believe it's the latter. And these are people with skin in the game, their businesses depend on sending tourists to destinations. They would love nothing more than to add Cambodia back to their portfolio of safe, attractive destinations. The fact that they're still expressing doubt tells you something about the gap between the Cambodian government's rhetoric and the reality on the ground.
Let's also consider the perspective of the potential tourists themselves, Alex. The people who would be booking these trips. The scam compound crisis didn't just affect the people who were trafficked. It sent a shockwave of fear through communities across Asia. Parents warned their children about fake job offers. Social media was flooded with stories and warnings. That kind of deep-seated anxiety about a destination doesn't evaporate because a tourism board CEO does an interview.
And there's a generational dimension to this. Many of the victims were young people, recent graduates, people in their 20s and 30s looking for economic opportunities. These are the same demographics that represent a core tourism market. They're the ones most likely to be planning trips, booking hostels, looking for adventure travel. And they're also the ones most likely to have seen the trafficking stories on social media, to have friends or acquaintances who were affected, or to have been personally warned by their families.
So rebuilding trust with that demographic requires more than glossy brochures and partnership agreements with travel agencies. It requires demonstrable, sustained, verifiable safety improvements. And it requires time. You can't accelerate trust building in the aftermath of a crisis this severe. It has to be earned through consistent action over years, not months.
Now, I want to address something that often gets lost in these discussions. Cambodia is a country with a traumatic history, extraordinary cultural heritage, and millions of ordinary people who had nothing to do with the scam compound industry. The people who depend on tourism for their livelihoods, the tuk-tuk drivers, the guest house owners, the restaurant workers, the guides at Angkor Wat, they are also victims of this crisis. Their incomes have been destroyed by something they had no part in creating.
That's an important point, and it's why the Cambodian government's failure to more aggressively address the root causes of the scam compound crisis is such a betrayal of its own people. Ordinary Cambodians who depend on tourism are paying the price for the government's failure to prevent these operations, its failure to root out the corruption that enabled them, and its failure to hold powerful figures accountable.
So when we evaluate Cambodia's tourism pitch to Hong Kong, we need to hold both truths simultaneously. Yes, Cambodia deserves the chance to rebuild its tourism industry. Yes, ordinary Cambodians shouldn't be punished indefinitely for the actions of criminal networks and corrupt officials. But also, yes, the concerns of Hong Kong travel agencies and tourists are legitimate, grounded in real experiences, and deserve more than reassuring words from a government that has not yet demonstrated sustained, transparent, and comprehensive action against the underlying problem.
And let's be clear about what accountability looks like in practice. It's not just shutting down a few compounds for the cameras. It's prosecuting the financiers. It's investigating the officials who granted the land concessions. It's publishing transparent reports on enforcement actions. It's inviting international monitoring. It's compensating victims. It's building a legal and regulatory framework that makes it structurally difficult for these operations to re-emerge.
Until that kind of comprehensive accountability framework is in place, tourism pitches, however well-intentioned, will continue to be met with the skepticism they're receiving from Hong Kong's travel industry. Trust is not a marketing problem. It's a governance problem. And governance problems require governance solutions, not PR campaigns.
There's also a broader lesson here for the region, Alex. Cambodia is not the only country grappling with the aftermath of the scam compound phenomenon. Myanmar's civil conflict has created ungoverned spaces where similar operations flourish with impunity. Laos has faced its own challenges with special economic zones that function as lawless enclaves. The Philippines has dealt with offshore gambling operations that blur the line between legitimate business and organized crime.
And the common thread across all of these cases is weak governance, corruption, and the exploitation of regulatory gaps by transnational criminal organizations. So while we're focused tonight on Cambodia's tourism pitch to Hong Kong, the underlying dynamic is regional and systemic. Any country in the region that fails to address corruption and strengthen its institutions is vulnerable to becoming the next host for these operations.
Which means that Cambodia's challenge isn't just about its own tourism industry. It's about whether the region as a whole can develop the institutional capacity to prevent criminal networks from setting up shop wherever governance is weakest. Because if Cambodia successfully shuts down every compound within its borders but the operations just migrate to the next country over, the problem isn't solved, it's just moved.
Let's talk about the role of technology in all of this, because it's central to both the problem and any potential solution. These scam compounds exist because digital technology made it possible to run large-scale fraud operations remotely. The victims inside the compounds aren't picking pockets on the street, they're running sophisticated online romance scams, cryptocurrency fraud schemes, and investment cons that target people thousands of miles away through their phones and computers.
And that technological dimension means that traditional law enforcement approaches are insufficient. You need cyber forensics capability. You need cryptocurrency tracing expertise. You need cross-border digital cooperation between law enforcement agencies. Cambodia's law enforcement infrastructure, frankly, is not equipped for that level of sophisticated technological investigation. So when the government says it's cracking down, you have to ask, with what capacity? With what expertise? With what resources?
That's a crucial point. International partnerships could help fill that gap. Interpol, the FBI, and various national law enforcement agencies have offered assistance. But effective international law enforcement cooperation requires a host government that is genuinely committed to the operation, willing to share information, and prepared to follow the evidence wherever it leads, including if it leads to politically connected figures. That's the test that Cambodia hasn't yet convincingly passed.
So where does this leave Hong Kong tourists and the travel agencies being courted by Cambodia's tourism board? In a state of wait and see, it seems. And honestly, that's a rational response. The travel industry is in the business of managing risk, and right now the risk profile for Cambodia, particularly for the demographics most vulnerable to trafficking, young, adventurous, solo travelers, remains elevated compared to regional alternatives.
It's also worth noting that Hong Kong's own government has a role to play here. Travel advisories, consular support capacity, and bilateral agreements on citizen protection all factor into whether travel agencies feel comfortable sending clients to a particular destination. If the Hong Kong government were to downgrade its travel advisory for Cambodia based on concrete, verified improvements in safety, that would send a powerful signal to the industry.
But that would require the Hong Kong government to conduct its own independent assessment of conditions on the ground in Cambodia, rather than relying on the Cambodian government's self-reporting. And that kind of independent verification is exactly what's needed, but also exactly what's difficult to achieve in a country where media freedom is constrained and civil society organizations operate under significant pressure.
Let's bring this full circle. The story of Cambodia trying to woo Hong Kong's travel industry is, on its surface, a business story about tourism recovery. But beneath the surface, it's a story about accountability, governance, human rights, and whether a country can genuinely reform or merely rebrand. Those are profoundly different things, and the distinction matters, not just for potential tourists, but for the thousands of people who were trafficked, exploited, and traumatized by the scam compound industry.
And the victims' voices need to be central to this conversation. Not the tourism board's marketing materials, not the diplomatic talking points, not the economic projections. The people who were trapped in those compounds, who were beaten for failing to meet scam quotas, who had their passports taken, who were sold between compounds like commodities, their experiences are the measure against which any claims of reform should be judged.
Absolutely. And until those victims have received justice, real justice, not just rescue and repatriation, but accountability for the people who profited from their suffering, any tourism pitch rings hollow. You can't build a tourism brand on the unmarked graves of accountability.
Now let's connect all of this to the broader pattern we see in corporate and government behavior worldwide, Alex. Because this Cambodia story isn't unique, it's a template. A harmful industry emerges, it generates enormous profits for a connected few, it causes widespread damage, and then when the reputational cost becomes too high, the response is not genuine reform but image management. We see it in fossil fuel companies' greenwashing. We see it in tech companies' privacy washing. And we see it in Cambodia's tourism washing.
That's a sharp observation, Maya. The playbook is remarkably consistent across sectors and across borders. Step 1, allow or enable a harmful practice because it generates economic activity. Step 2, deny or minimize the harm when it's exposed. Step 3, make cosmetic changes and launch a PR campaign. Step 4, claim the problem is solved and push to move on. The question is always whether Step 5 happens, genuine, structural reform. And Step 5 is rare because it's expensive, politically difficult, and requires confronting the very power structures that benefited from the harm in the first place.
And what makes the Cambodia case particularly instructive is that the harm was so visible, so dramatic, and so well documented that the usual playbook of deny and delay was never really an option. You can't deny the existence of compounds that were raided on camera, that released hundreds of trafficking victims, that were the subject of international diplomatic incidents. So the government skipped straight to the rebranding phase, which is why we're seeing the tourism pitch now, arguably before the underlying problems have been adequately addressed.
The test for Cambodia, and for any country or corporation in a similar situation, is whether they're willing to endure the short-term pain of genuine accountability for the long-term gain of real trust. Quick fixes and charm offensives might generate some short-term tourist bookings, but they won't build the kind of durable reputation that sustains a tourism industry over decades. That requires the hard, unglamorous work of institutional reform, anti-corruption enforcement, and sustained transparency.
And the Hong Kong travel agencies who are expressing skepticism? They're performing exactly the function that a healthy market should perform. They're saying, show us the evidence. Don't just tell us it's safe, prove it. Don't just promise reform, demonstrate it. That kind of market-driven accountability pressure can be a powerful complement to diplomatic and regulatory pressure. When an industry says we won't send our clients until we're convinced it's safe, that's a signal that no amount of marketing spend can overcome.
So here's our call to action tonight. If you're watching this from Hong Kong, or from anywhere in Asia, and you're thinking about travel to Cambodia, do your research. Look beyond the tourism marketing. Check the latest travel advisories from your government. Read the investigative journalism. Talk to people who've been there recently. Make an informed decision based on evidence, not on brochures.
And if you're a policymaker, whether in Cambodia, in Hong Kong, or in any of the countries affected by the scam compound crisis, demand accountability. Demand transparency. Demand that enforcement actions are sustained, not performative. Demand that victims receive justice and compensation. And demand that the structural conditions that enabled this crisis, the corruption, the weak governance, the regulatory gaps, are addressed at their root.
Because at the end of the day, this isn't just about tourism. It's about whether governments can be held accountable for the harm that occurs on their watch, under their jurisdiction, often with the knowledge or involvement of their officials. Cambodia's answer to that question will determine not just the future of its tourism industry, but the future of its relationship with the international community.
And to the victims of the scam compound industry, the people who were trafficked, exploited, and traumatized, your stories matter. Your experiences are not a PR problem to be managed. They are a human rights crisis that demands justice. And we will continue to report on whether that justice is being delivered.
That's our show for tonight. I'm Alex Truth, reminding you that the truth doesn't need a marketing campaign, it just needs people willing to tell it.
And I'm Maya Clarity. Stay informed, stay skeptical, and never stop asking who benefits when powerful institutions ask you to just trust them. We'll see you next time on Truth Report.
Good night, everyone.